today we have the absolutely brilliant Charlie and Uzma, who both work for Genius Within, to talk to us about intersectionality. So please keep your microphones on mute throughout their talk, but you can ask questions in the chat, which will be monitored by myself and Jackie from Genius Within. And then at the end, we'll have time for a Q&A session, and I can read through some of the questions on the chat and they can be answered in person. Or if you would like to ask the question yourself, if you just raise your hand, I will invite you to unmute and you can ask the question yourself. So I'm just going to stop sharing and I will hand over to the brilliant Charlie and Uzma, who both have, as with our previous two speakers, the most enormous amount of professional qualifications that I couldn't even begin to do justice to. So I will hand over to them and they can tell you what they are going to be talking to us about today. So over to you, Charlie and Uzma.
Lovely, thanks Kirsty. Hopefully you can see my slides. Am I sharing correctly? You're on mute.
Yes, looking fabulous, Charlie.
Sorry,
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody who's joining us this afternoon, especially for those of you who are either balancing off the 20-degree heat in the garden or indeed are combining both and are listening or viewing us from somewhere sunny. This is the third session that Genius Within has done. And with a view to that, we'll be doing brief recaps of certain things like what neurodiversity is. But today's session is actually about intersectionality. So just looking at our session outcomes, what I'd like to do, whilst I just outline where we're going to go today, it'd be really helpful for us if you could introduce yourselves in the chat. So a bit of a warm up on the fingers and thumbs, please. We're going to have an interactive session. So just pop into the chat any reasons why you're actually here. It might be to do with your role. It might be something to do with family or having friends with neurodiversity. Anything at all that you think might be relevant. And Uzma's going to keep an eye on that whilst I just carry on with my intro. So the first thing we're going to do, as I say, is a brief recap into neurodiversity for those of you who weren't in our previous session. What I would say is that those sessions have been recorded, so please do revisit any that you've not gone to so far. We're going to talk about intersectionality, what that actually means, and how that interlinks with neurodiversity. I'm then going to hand over to Uzma, who's going to look at marginalisation. And this is when my dog comes back in and interrupts me. Hello, good boy. There it is. And she's also going to talk about how this impacts on us as individuals. And you're going to have an interactive way of considering marginalisation. Then we're going to talk about where we are now. We're going to share some of our own personal experiences and also think about what we can do next and what, if I say we, I mean as a group of advertisers, what we can do going forward. So, very brief introduction to neurodiversity. And by neurodiversity, I'm actually talking about the differences in how we think across our whole species. And if you look at my diagram there, if I was to do some cognitive assessing on the entire world, what I would find is that about 2/3 of the population have skills that are roughly the same in all areas, and I would call them generalist thinkers. About 1/3 of the population has more significant strengths and weaknesses across their cognitive profile, and I would call them specialist thinkers, and indeed neurominority conditions such as ADHD, dyslexia, autism fall under this category of specialist thinkers. So what that means is that people with those conditions will excel at certain tasks and in certain areas, and may find other environments or scenarios disabling because they might not be set up to manage that skill set. And what we need to think about is how we can support all thinkers. And of course, today, what we're going to do is think about what that means in the advertising industry. So a couple of our favorite stats that it's impossible for us to not bring up. 90% of all disabilities are not visible, which means that exclusion is the norm. Just let that one sit with you for a wee while. So if we think about public spaces and also work environments, traditionally they have been set up for generalist thinkers. This is maybe more obvious to think about with non-hidden disabilities. So if we think about physical disabilities and how over the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, public spaces have become constructed so that people who are physically disabled are able to access them better, but still with far to go. If you think about this in terms of hidden disability, of course, you don't know what you don't know, and you can't see what you can't see. So my diagram here is a kind of classic shot of the education system. And what we do is we say that everybody in school has to do the same qualifications. And what that means is that those who don't excel in those public exams, so if we think about gateway qualifications like Maths and English GCSE, for example, if people do not excel in those, then they leave school underqualified and quite often with this negative self-belief that in some cases lives with them the rest of their lives. And indeed, to break through that barrier of self-belief, people have to swim upstream. It's not the norm to be able to get through that. Guys, if you could just switch off your mics, that would be great. Thank you. So advertisers traditionally have appealed to the norm group. And I want you to think about the power of that, and by reflecting back societal norms, also holding up this standard of what is acceptable, and also the power as advertisers to hold that norm and what it means. So what is the responsibility that brands have to their consumers and also wider society? That's what we're going to be thinking about today. So neurominority or specialist thinkers, in order to have those strengths and weaknesses, of course, we've been looking at the difficulties briefly there, such as are highlighted in the school system, but of course it means that there are also strengths associated with these neurominority conditions. And here's a very pretty diagram designed by Jackie Wallace, thank you Jackie, that shows some of those strengths associated with our neurominority conditions. So my colleagues have already talked to you about how we make certain environments and scenarios accessible to all through universal design and also systemic inclusion. Today, we're going to look at the intersection of different points of these minority groups. And we're going to show how this can lead to discrimination. And as far as advertising is concerned, traditionally, these minority groups and layers of minority groups have been underrepresented. So what are the things that we need to consider? What is it that we need to think about moving forward with advertising and with branding? And why is it that despite us having this better awareness of neurominorities and also of neurominority strengths, why have we still got that underrepresentation? And the feeling that I get is that there is a lot of good intention, but maybe people don't always have that know-how to put it into impact. So how are we going to have that impact? How can we make a difference? And you'll leave today with some of those how-tos. So as a business psychologist, it's really difficult for me to not introduce some employment figures for you, which is where we're going to go next, just briefly. Let's look at these. So what's going on? So we've got some UK and US figures here. So 3/4 of the UK population is in employment, and that's approximately 60% in the US. Now, that's not to say that the rest of them are unemployed. Everybody else might consist of students or retirees, people not in working age. The unemployment figures are more like 4% in the UK and 6% in the US. Shockingly, however, less than 15% of autists are actually in employment, and almost 30% of the dyslexic community make up long-term unemployment, which is kind of shocking. And why is this so big when we're aware of neurodiversity strengths? What's going on? And this is an example of an intersection, a double point of discrimination in which we've got two minority groups overlapping. So people with a hidden disability in an ableist world who are also unemployed. I'm just going to overlay another example here. So we know that at least 1/4 of the prison population has ADHD. So there's a third layer of potential discrimination. And I'd like you to think of all prisoners as returning citizens and, of course, returning customers. And I'm now going to hand over to Uzma.
Thanks, Charlie. So I think that was, that slide that you've all just seen there with 25% of the prison population is ADHD. That really sort of struck me, because when you look at the figures, I think approximately 1% of the population is actually autistic, but yet make up a quarter of the prison population. And like Charlie had mentioned, what is actually going on there? And hopefully I'm going to try and sort of unpick that a little by just talking to you a little bit more about intersectionality itself. However, before I do that, I want to gauge a sense of how we as a group here identify ourselves. So thank you very much for all those I've already shared in chat in terms of what your role is. I can see we've got a very dynamic group here, and you all have been working or have some exposure to neurodiversity in different capacities. So whether it's a family member, as a parent, whether you are yourself, or whether it is in fact working with somebody that you are supporting. So I would like you to go, and I can see that some people have actually already started. So I would like you to go to the survey on Menti and enter the survey code 6246789. And I'm going to share my screen so that I can present the results as they're coming through. So first one being, which of these attributes have the strongest effect on how you see yourself?
Uzma, could you tell us the code again, please?
The code is right on the top there. So
oh yeah,
it's 6246789.
Hey, sorry, can I just ask for the link to the survey, because I couldn't copy and paste it, so
it's there on the top as well. So it's www.menti.com. Yeah.
Okay.
Or just put in Menti into Google and it'll take you straight to Mentimeter, and you can just put in the code there. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to try and get that through. So you've got 13 options to choose from. And already
Look at that.
we can see that change there. And these are the different aspects or different attributes that we potentially identify with that make up a whole person. And, it's a case of, well, what has the strongest impact on us? And you can already see some peaks there in terms of our abilities, education, employment status. And I can see that consistently abilities, employment status seems to be remaining sort of in the top 4 or 5 at least. So I'm just going to let that one carry on. And moving on to the next slide, which some of you have already sort of started completing. Which of these attributes do you feel you are most oppressed by in your society? Again, same 13 options. And what plays into this potentially is how you perceive others see you. But more importantly, which do you feel you're most oppressed by in your society? So abilities doesn't come in here, which featured in the top 5 for the previous question in terms of how you see yourselves, but you feel oppressed by, from what the results are saying, race and ethnicity, diagnosis, your physical appearance, gender identity, employment status has sort of fallen down into the ranking order here. Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Just before you go on, so a couple of people have asked on the previous slide, there's a split on the bar for abilities. And what does that mean?
There shouldn't be a split on the bar. I don't know why there's a split on the bar.
Okay, so someone else has said it maybe had an option in twice, so that's why it's split.
Yeah, I need to take that up with Menti, I'm afraid. But I did notice that it's 12%. It's not a split in the bar. That obviously meant to say anything else. So I'm going to stop sharing that and move back to the slides. Thanks, Charlie.
Of course.
And so just want to let that sit with everybody as I sort of move on to what intersectionality is. And I'm sure that is going to play back into our minds in terms of how you would relate that back into what we are going to be talking about in the next 20 minutes. So what is sectionality? Now, Kimberly Crenshaw, she actually defines this as a prism through which you see a problem. I'm just going to read out this quote here. A lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here or a gender problem here and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things or more than one of these things within a person. And what this is actually highlighting is that we are not siloed people. We are overlapping, we are nuanced, we are multiplex in our lives, in our identity, and in our experiences. And if we understand intersectionality and some of the barriers that can come with them, we can understand how we can create pathways through these barriers. So just keep thinking back to those statistics that those employment statistics that we were referring to, how there's a discrepancy in terms of what is happening in our population, but what is actually happening in various groups in society, like the prison population, employment, etc. So what we're highlighting here is that a person or a group of people are complex and they're a dynamic system, and you cannot separate that person from the system. Moreover, it's about how we see ourselves as well as how others see us. And if there's a misalignment there, we are going to feel oppressed. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the different factors that play into those intersectionalities on the next slide. And what you see here is quite a bit of a reductionist perspective, and it only shows some of those identities as part of a much more complex tapestry of what makes a person. And what I want to highlight is the need to consider both the situational and dispositional influences on behaviour, and how these focus on one influence or behaviour over others. So before I talk about this sort of picture here, this image here, I want to just lay out what psychologists' sort of perspective they look through when it comes to identifying a person. So you've got the situationism view, which is a view that our behaviour and actions are determined by our immediate environment and surroundings. And in contrast, you've got the dispositionism, and that holds that our behaviour is determined by internal factors like personality traits and temperament. Social psychologists have tended to take the situationist perspective, whereas some psychologists have promoted the dispositional perspective. And in some ways, you could say that intersectionality sits in the centre of that to connect the two, the internal and the external. So what we have here are just some broad factors that can impact an individual's identity and therefore responsive behaviour. So you've got the person's age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, for instance. And then you've got the external factors that could also impact their identity, which some of us have actually, already attributed to, such as socioeconomic status, educational system, culture variations, and the structural issues. Structural issues being accessibility in the market, for instance. And just to give a rough idea of what's going on, when we move on to this slide that you're seeing now, where we've picked out some facts and figures in recent research about the new intersection of neurodiversity and how that maps out against gender, identity, sexual orientation, etc. So this is looking at the lack of recognition or referral, which is one of the impacts that we've seen in terms of age. And so what we have seen is documented ADHD in children and adolescents is double what is recognised in adults. And the prevalence of ADHD is estimated at, for instance, 7.1% in children and adolescents, 2.5%, so it's reducing when it comes to adults, and around 2.8% in older adults. And we can provide references for these facts and these surveys later on. And then moving on to the next slide, what you see here again is lack of recognition and or referral bias when it comes to gender, females specifically. We've noticed a discrepancy in the ratio of males to females with diagnosed ADHD, for instance. And the sex differences in the prevalence of ADHD are actually pretty well documented. So for some of you, it might not be new news. I mean, clinical referrals in boys typically exceed those for girls. And this is a ratio ranging from, depending on what survey that you look at, 3:1 to 16:1 to boys. So it's always going to be a higher ratio of boys having access or being referred to a diagnosis. And moving on, if we were to sort of look at racial and ethnic disparities, these are quite significant and exist in the recognition of autism, for instance. So 58%, and this is one study in particular, of children had a documented autism spectrum condition. And when they obviously looked at the broader sort of demographic of the children that they were looking at, children who were Black, Hispanic, or of another race and ethnicity were less likely than white children to have a documented autism, so documented a diagnosis. I just want to make a note here that race and ethnicity is not interchangeable. So obviously, you know, it's what you look at it in that respect. So these are just, you know, thoughts that I'm just putting out there for you. And then finally, when we move on to sexuality, for instance, we've seen that there's a non-heterosexuality, you know, greater prevalence in the autistic population. So more likely to be gender diverse and have a lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or asexual sexual orientation compared to a neurotypical person. And in this particular study, we found that a group with autism, 69.7% reported being non-heterosexual, but neurotypical people group, they actually reported being non-heterosexual by 30.3%. And the autism group reported higher rates of homosexuality, bisexuality, and asexuality, but lower rates of heterosexuality. And so what we're saying here is important to increase that awareness about increased non-heterosexuality in autism among autistic populations, professionals and caretakers, you know, to provide that increased support and inclusion for non-heterosexual autistic individuals. And this is just one study that is obviously highlighting that prevalence within one particular neurodiverse profile. So what we're basically trying to do is introduce the idea that intersectionality impacts on consumers. It's about representation from a systemic view rather than at the individual or select level within an individual. And it's about making progress towards a task to develop and equip industries, you know, like yourselves, to work more actively with underrepresented groups so that you can facilitate more equitable participation in that common market. Understand that intersectionality is talking about all the pieces of who we are. And this, the impact of those intersections clearly lead to those internalized outcomes. And that is where we can potentially feel oppressed or marginalized. And it can impact the fact that we may not have, you know, a diagnosis or may have a misdiagnosis, for instance, if these things aren't being recognized and attributed to other aspects of our identity. So what this is getting at is that where communities are marginalized by, say, race or poverty, they are less likely to receive adequate diagnosis. So just to sort of go around this cloud here, in terms of identity, we've already shown you that females in general have historically been overlooked and misdiagnosed. You know, where else can this impact? We've got integration of personality, misdiagnosis, especially in relation to gender and race, you know, relationship between Blackness and perceived, you know, risk, dangerousness. How can this influence misdiagnosis? For instance, there's a higher prevalence of a diagnosis of schizophrenia amongst this population rather than autism. It can also impact our identity in terms of an inbuilt sense of imposter syndrome, which is an example of intersectionality, like being a neurodiverse woman of color. And, you know, what would be some of the challenges that are faced? Is that imposter syndrome going to be exasperated? And then there's obviously the trust element in terms of how that can impact an individual, how communities that have been minoritized by race might interact or not interact with the market, with systems, with white institutions, and what is the ripple effect of this. So from an intersectional perspective, I guess, what we're trying to say here is you need to consider the prevalence of the, myth as well as the underdiagnosis of neurodiversity amongst those people that are going to participate in the common market, and the impact that this has on identity, integration of personality, emotion, imposter syndrome, and trust in professional services, and what other groups are marginalized. Advertising industry, I think, has a very key role here and a responsibility to be representative at the business level. And at the these intersections, when you have somebody that is intersecting with across two or more groups, what are the composite consumer voices that are not being heard? Is this something that is being played into the marketing brief, the market research that is being carried out or being done? And I suppose the takeaway message is make a progress towards a mission to represent those underrepresented groups. Does messaging match the audience? Brand responsibility to consumers? Do you have the correct representation of people coming into the industry that are then going to be, actually cognizant with the society out there? So do you have that match representation of people working for you that will be able to highlight what the needs of the consumers may be, for instance? So I'm just going to pass back to Charlie, who will then sort of take you on terms of what else we can learn from diversity and inclusion, and build those sort of outcomes that you can put in place and those action steps.
Lovely, thank you very much, Uzma. Great, so we're going to look at the learning from D&I, so diversity, equity and inclusion. We've heard about some of the research and evidence. We know about the impact. So what can we do to both represent and also protect our customers? And how can we do this responsibly? And what I mean by that is not inadvertently causing harm. So we're going to be looking at how messaging matches the audience and how can we make sure of that? And also, what do we know? What has already happened in other sectors, in other areas of D&I, and how do we avoid those things? So I'm going to work on the basis that we have an implicit bias towards white, middle-class, straight men. And what we need to do then is become more authentic as representatives and as trying to represent our communities at large. And I've got three key things here that we've got to avoid as advertisers. And I'm going to ask Uzma to help me with this one because I can't actually see our chat. So I'm just going to put the audience, everybody on the spot a little bit, please. Who knows what virtue signalling is? So into the chat, please, if you will. And Uzma, if you can just keep an eye on that, or Kirsty, that would be great.
Yeah.
So what do we mean by virtue signalling? Are we getting anywhere?
Doing things for doing things' sake. So we've
Yeah.
got that. Pretending you care.
Yeah, pretending you care, absolutely. So this idea that you've got this kind of morally disingenuous viewpoint in order to look good. So anything else coming up along those lines, isn't it?
Yeah, when you make a big deal about doing a good deed, doing it to look good.
Exactly.
Box ticking. Love that.
Yeah.
Box ticking.
So
and
this is like flying...
empty brand statements. Love that one.
Oh, I like that, empty brand statements.
Yeah.
So this is flying rainbow flags for pride, but actually really not giving a monkey's armpit about your LGBTQ staff. What about performance activism? Yeah, what do we mean by that? What's performance activism then?
Saying you will be represented when you actually aren't.
So the clue is, my clue for you is white male celebrities for this one, performance activism. Who might even have a book out shortly.
So they're all coming through, and if I was to put it into a cluster, I'd say, you know, superficial behaviour, so no action, just words, pretending to care for the kudos, not doing the real work behind the scenes. So those are the boxes that we've got. Yeah,
absolutely that. And then at the end saying, and back to me again.
yeah.
So it's about using that opportunistically to refocus back to yourself. And tokenism as that last one then. What do we mean by that?
Got some thinking here. Still waiting.
I think that's nicely covered off by the ticking the box comment that we had earlier, isn't it?
Yeah. Same again. So tick boxing, being seen to do the right thing, arbitrary inclusion. Thank you, Michael Barton.
Small symbolic additions. Okay, so what works then? So embedding inclusion as standard. Different thinkers have different communication preferences. How are you going to reach them? And then how will you know? Well, you'll know by testing with a representative group, making sure that you get approval from a diverse range of potential consumers. Avoiding structural exclusion. So to do that, you focus on the end user. So always have the end user in mind, and we're looking at acceptance. Rather than focusing on somebody's diagnosis, it's thinking about what is the general need of our consumers, not who has ADHD and what percentage of them are dyslexic. Knowing that you can't always get it right, but having many options on the go. And basically thinking about your own organisations when you're going through this as well. So this idea that if we don't appeal to the widest possible audience, then we're not going to be representative of the customer base, and as a consequence, we're going to limit the market. So a couple of questions for you guys to think about yourself then. How well is this done already then, but in your own organisation? So if we took your organisation as a microcosm of systemic inclusion and supporting neurodiverse people, then how well are you already doing it? And is your behaviour in-house reflective of how you manage your own customer base, or indeed those of the brands that you manage? So how open internally are you? And if you're not actually reflecting the values and you're not doing that for your customer base, then how will you know if your messaging is off? So what we tend to do is we go into organisations and we help them get their own house in order. This is something that you can do yourselves with a lot of reflection on, but quite often it falls on the shoulders of people who are the nominated EDI group, or indeed one person because they happen to have a family member with neurodiverse conditions. And what we do is we come in and we'll make sure that your internal processes are fair. We ensure that you guys can all work at your best. And we can also use universal design to evaluate some designs that you've done, guide you in design process, and also help you educate your own consumers. This is something that we do in conjunction with other organisations, and I'd really suggest that you look at the Business Disability Forum, look at our website, look at the Valuable 500, and just see about some of the shortcuts that you can make rather than doing this all off your own backs. Like I say, indeed, we'll be giving you some opportunities to contact us later after some Q&A. But first of all, Uzma and I thought it would be great if we could just talk about some of our own personal experiences of intersectionality. So, Uzma, over to you.
I suppose this is looking at just giving you a very quick summary of my lived experience when it comes to intersectionality, and then love to hear what Charlie's is, because we all have some aspect of that, and mine very quickly is being a non-ADHD partner in an ADHD relationship. So my partner is ADHD, obviously South Asian, and works in a very large public sector industry. And one of the things that they've obviously had issues with, and we've obviously tried to work through together as a result of that, is where they are a Asian male with ADHD, and they obviously have different ways of processing I suppose, social signals, that sort of thing. They have struggled with raising themselves across the career ladder, and a lot of the issues that come across in terms of their performance reviews, for instance, is issues with the basic communication skills and lack of empathy. And what they've done is actually attributed it to cultural differences. So the thing that they can see, the intersection, the actual bit of the identity they can see. So they feel oppressed by their race and identity, race and ethnicity, as opposed to actually even getting as far as highlighting there is a neurodiversity aspect here as well. And it's difficult to sort of, cross those barriers. Which one is it that you address first? So that's the sort of issue that we've had when it comes to our own intersections in terms of neurodiversity and society in general. How about you, Charlie? So to what extent do you feel your intersections have been represented?
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? Because of course we're talking to a group of advertisers. So the thing that really comes up for me is being about 18 or 19 years of age. And for me, this is a story of two advertising billboards. So at the age of 18, 19, I had just gone to university, and I am very fortunate to have come from a very loving background in which I was accepted for who I was. And I got to university having realised that I was a gay woman, and my daily walk to university meant that I walked past a huge billboard that said, "Keep Section 28," which was a billboard put up by the Tory parties. And for those of you who are too young to remember Section 28, this was a statute in law that said that you could not promote homosexuality in the classroom, which actually meant that teachers and educators, in effect, weren't able to talk about their own sexuality. And there was a huge big deal that it was kept in Scotland longer than England and Wales. And this was this huge board that I walked past that was a moral statement to me on a daily basis that my lifestyle choices were not acceptable and that they were wrong. And I internalized that even though I didn't want to. And it was this reminder that I was in this minority group and kind of with almost like a dirty little secret at a time when I was trying to get to understand myself and my identity better. So that's my billboard number one. And my billboard number two is one that will always stay in mind I want to say maybe a year or two later. And I was in Manchester, Piccadilly, and many of you will know that Manchester has a very big gay scene. And at the time I had been out very late with my partner and we'd missed the last train home from Manchester. And I remember feeling a little bit vulnerable in a train station of a kind of open train station where there had been gay bashing and there'd been all kinds of things, and it felt a little bit volatile and I felt quite vulnerable. And I looked up and there was a huge billboard for Queer as Folk, which was the new Russell T Davies programme, which some of you might remember, basically an absolute poster for gay rights and it being okay to live a gay lifestyle. And I remember thinking what an antidote that was. So yeah, kind of the flip side of the negative side, but so powerful. And I really feel quite strongly about this idea that as advertisers, it's such a responsibility, and I don't mean to burden you guys, but it's withholding that societal norm as well, isn't it? And getting the messages right for all of us. So did you want to chat any more about that, Uzma, before we go to Q&A?
No, I would love to hear from the group now, I think.
Okay, I'm going to leave the slide up if that's okay, because I know some people will ask us about how they can reach out. So I'll leave that up whilst we do some Q&A, but I need you to check the questions for me if that's okay.
Yep. Amy China, is that amazing program to us, or is that just what Charlie was referencing to? I hope it was both.
Yes, both, but definitely Queer as Folk. Good memories of watching that. So
yeah,
nice to hear
great,
that.
wasn't it?
Okay, so I'd love to understand where OCD sits on the neurodiverse spectrum. Ooh.
Well, it's one of my own personal labels, so I'm happy to take that one if you like.
Go on.
So it's interesting. It's quite often missed off. We're looking at about a couple of percent across the world, and so interestingly, talking about intersection, I was diagnosed with ADHD a year or so ago, and I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder about the same time I was internalizing those Section 28 billboards. I've not really thought about the connection there before, but I'll park that one for now. And as is very common for women with ADHD, it's quite often we're finding late diagnosis, and quite often those women were not picked up. So I've just turned 40, so I was not picked up as an ADHD in education. And it's very common for women to have a history of anxiety disorders or similar, and so OCD would sit under that as an anxiety disorder. And my psychiatrist is quite sure that if I'd had ADHD picked up, then I would not have an OCD label. And in actual fact, obsessive compulsive disorder probably grew for me out of a need for control because my ADHD wasn't managed. So I went a bit personal then, didn't I? I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I've just put in the chat here, please feel free to unmute your mic. So even if it is the question, it's something that you want to share in terms of how you feel your own intersections may potentially have been represented. I think, this is really good for us to get some sort of exposure to that.
Did we know what the roles were, Osmo? What kind of roles? With? Shall I stop sharing and then we can see everybody's faces? That would be fun.
Charlie, we have quite a good question here from Kerry, who works at MasterCard. Kerry, would you like to unmute and ask a question yourself, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, and guys, do put your videos on now. Let's go for chat if you'd like to. That would be great. Still can't see chat. What's the question in the chat, Kirsty?
It's no, I've lost it. It's a question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Kerry's going to be reading her question, but I can read it out if Kerry doesn't appear. So Kerry says, do companies usually tackle all neurodiverse types at once for improving employee hiring / performance, or do you advise to start with one, and if one, which one?
So I did that ADHD thing of pretending to listen to what you just said there, and I didn't actually take that in. What was the question again?
So the question was, do companies usually tackle all neurodiversity types at once for improving employee hiring / performance, or do you advise to start with one? And if one, then which one?
So definitely not one.
I would recommend that you watch my previous colleagues' talks on systemic inclusion design. So it's this idea that if we get it right for all, then it doesn't actually matter what someone's diagnosis is. And in actual fact, you've got to remember that most people won't have a diagnosis. It's a privilege to have a diagnosis, and so it's not the right starting point.
Yeah, I think Louise Saunders has just hit the nail on the head. Yes, universal design. So it definitely would signpost to the end of the last program that was presented last week. And I think it just comes down to tokenism and potential positive discrimination. If you are going to exclude other neurodiverse profiles just purely to select and focus on one, with all good intention, but at the end of the day, when, like you said, there is that misdiagnosis or lack of diagnosis, you're going to really narrow the market already. So I think it's just an investment that's not really going to give you much in return.
I think also, it's important, that actually this is so important, but it's probably one of those times to get the experts in. And I know that sounds like a bit of a hard sell from me, but this can be done very badly. And as expert witnesses, we have to advise to stop people going to tribunal. And it's not hard to get it right, but it's easy to get it wrong. And I'd really recommend handing it over at that point and getting some expert advice, to be honest, to make sure you get it right from the outset.
Thank you.
We've got a hand up for Michael Barton.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, everyone. So,
question I have to ask, for say a statement that I think one of the main barriers to, well, leading a happy, comfortable life, however you want to put it, especially when it comes to autism, is the stigma. I mean, we all know autism is an invisible condition, and yet people, even though everyone's heard of autism, they don't really understand what it means. So my question to the panel is, what do you think is the best thing that we could do to help minimize, if not eradicate, the stigma surrounding the neurodiversity conditions?
So you're describing my daily life. Actually, I go to work in order to do this, and it's to keep on keeping on. And, you know, I guess right back to you guys, I'd say, what can you do as advertisers to help with this? It's not rhetorical. I dare you to unmute.
Well, actually, I have a sort of comment on this. Actually, it's not really a question. When you're talking about, well, about the whole intersectionality piece, is that when you look at how autism is represented, usually in film, I mean, I'm not an expert. This is just my observation. In films and in I don't know if it's even. I can't think of examples of it being represented in advertising, but in films, there tends to be a particular type of person who is seen as an autistic person, which is generally like a Big Bang Theory type, you know, it's usually a white man, isn't it? And they usually have a particular type of autism, which is often romanticized in terms of, you know, their unique skills, but not really, it doesn't really cover the full complexity of it. And I think that's quite interesting that that seems to be the way that society thinks about autistic people.
Absolutely. And this is really topical for us and everyone at the moment. We're going into Autism Month. And even this idea of autism awareness is kind of gaslighting, actually. And so, Uzma, we were just chatting on the chat about this. What was it? You're too pretty to be autistic. Is that what the comment was this afternoon? Yeah, I'm getting...
She's not talking about me, but yes, there was a message. Yes, but there was a GIF that actually, you know, a statement that was said to somebody: "You're too pretty to be autistic. You're a girl."
Yes, it's these stereotypes that come out of having certain labels, and basically, if you're not struggling enough, then we're not actually going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and you can't have any help, and shut up is basically the message there. So yeah, we are constantly trying to stereotype bust. We are constantly myth busting, and it is an ongoing battle. And I think that, you know, it's caught up because when you've met one autistic, you've met one autistic. When you've met one ADHD, you've met one ADHD. And so even I, who stand here as an expert before you, I'm not the expert in every individual ADHDer's way of being. But at least I'm aware of that, right? And I can talk about that and hold that space responsibly. And we're fighting against people without any expertise, as Kirsty and I were talking about beforehand, weren't we?
We were.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, advertising has got, you know, a wonderful opportunity here to actually break the mold.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question that's come in, sort of quite a practical question again about hiring, which is when developing an equal opportunity form for new starters and existing staff, how would you tackle the subject of neurodiversity on a form? Would you list all forms of neurodiversity as a tick box option, or is that what would you recommend there?
So this is a really easy one, and what we do is we would recommend that people ask what do you need to work at your best, and then we might give examples of some of the things that we put in place for other people before, so that there are kind of suggestions of accommodations that can be made. And that is a question that can be asked of everyone.
Charlie, just saying, Nancy's contributed in the chat to this and just said get rid of the form. We don't like the form.
We don't like forms.
We don't work with the need for diagnosis as well. So I've also put in there a link to a what we call a Genius Screener, which is a free 64 question yes/no questionnaire that you could use as a framework for people to look at what they might need to work at their best. So it gives you a personalized report instantly as a PDF that you could then use as a framework to discuss with people what they might need. And those are based on thousands of data points of things that we've already learned from all of the people that we've worked with for the last 10 years. So I've just put the link into there. That's useful.
I think what's great about that as well, actually, is it gives managers who are maybe feeling a little bit out of their depth the right kind of questions and the right kind of rhetoric to hang their hat on. So it's reassuring for anybody who's just feeling their way and wanting to get it right for their colleagues.
Thank you. I've just seen quite a long comment come in from Nicola Clifton on the chat. Nicola, is that, without me reading it out, is there a question in there that you'd like to ask directly?
It's more to do with, I don't work in employment now, although I did in a previous role employ lots of people and promoted diversity. It seems that there's this romantic view of autistic geniuses, but there's actually also quite a lot of autistic people who do have learning disabilities, but have plenty of skills to be very employable. And it's quite interesting, having gone around a lot of the local London councils that are working with organisations to promote employability for people with large organisations. It seems still very early days in that format. I've spoken with Hammersmith, Kensington and various other councils, and I'm kind of curious how that develops in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years, because I'm not really seeing it. I've freelanced and I'm not really seeing that very much in companies that I've worked in advertising.
So what is it that you're not seeing specifically?
I'm not really seeing, I haven't really come across situations where I've really seen autistic people who do have a mild form of learning disability working in as many work environments as I think there is potential.
Okay. So I'm just going to tease out that, because I might be hearing an assumption, but I might not, but I just want to check with you. So autism and intellect are not interlinked. So I know in the past that is something that people have misunderstood, that people can be high or low functioning with autism, and it's not the case. So I'm just going to hold that. And it's interesting because we talk a lot actually about autism awareness programs and also bringing autists into the workplace, and I'm sure some of you will have seen that certain companies do that. GCHQ are in the press for that, and in actual fact that's positive discrimination. So it's something that we talk quite a bit about at Genius Within, and I'm just wondering, it almost feels like what it might be about where you're seeing that. I mean, you're absolutely right, because we've got underrepresentation, but I'm not too sure.
I think
sorry. Can I just say one thing? That's actually very interesting what you've said, because my experience is I have a 21-year-old autistic, but mine's probably out of date, but we were always told 75% of autistic people had some form of learning disability. And that was just what the National Autistic Society used to say, and maybe they've updated that information. But I'm just curious about the percentage of people within that are employable, that you just don't seem to see the opportunities for, that actually there should be.
Can I come in on this, Nicola? Because I quite agree with you. My first job ever was working in a locally based hospital unit for adults with learning disabilities, and back in the 90s, when we were just starting to have local units, and actually people had been in institutions prior to this. So it's actually something that I know quite a lot about. And yeah, I mean, learning disability is a co-occurrence with autism in a lot of cases, but it isn't the same as autism, and autism kind of is a different thing. But we're really only just starting to learn what those differences are. So from a neurological perspective,
The more recent research that's coming out is about the particular brain pattern of communication between different parts of the brain that autistic people have, that means that autistic people are more sensitive to their environment than neurotypical people. But I think, at Genius Within, we do quite a lot of work with people who are long-term unemployed. We work with MenCap. We work in prisons, and I think one of the reasons that we push back against the autism at work paradigm, which I know is really, really popular, and it feels almost mean to start saying that it's not where we need it to be, because it's been such a transformational point of kind of thinking about people's strengths rather than people's weaknesses. But actually what it has done is really skewed people's interpretation of what autism is. And so I think your point is that what we're almost doing is top slicing when we focus on certain neurodiversities over others. And if we're doing inclusion, it's got to be inclusion for everybody. And if we're doing human value, then it's got to be all humans have value. And where do we cut that? Where do we put that cut off? And I think that's a really important point. But for me, it goes to, people who can work and who want to work. We should be finding ways to facilitate work and contribution and a sense of human connection and human purpose. And that's kind of where we're aiming most of our resources and services. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in there because I know this is kind of my area of speciality much more than it is Uzma's and Charlie's. So I just wanted to jump in there. And we were in the, we're here talking to you about employment, but Genius Within has a whole team of 30 people who work in unemployment. And in our unemployment division, we see a lot more variety in terms of people's strengths and weaknesses and where people can kind of be pointed for a vocational career guidance. And that is something that we're very inclusive about.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks so much. So I think probably as we're getting to the end of the hour, maybe we'll start to wrap up. And I think if anyone has any more questions that they would like to ask, then perhaps Jackie might be the go-to person, or anything that you want to find out more about Genius Within and how Genius Within works with different organisations. I think you can get straight in touch with Jackie. Her email is in the chat. And I think from my perspective, just to wrap up, I think this has been a really fascinating hour. I feel like I've learned so much. And I think what's really clear is that our industry has a huge responsibility. So we have a responsibility to reflect the true society that we're talking to. And I think the only way that we can do that is by having a true representation of society within our industry and within the creative process in what we produce. So I think that's something for everyone to think about, I guess. And we'll have the recording of this available for everyone at some point very soon on the IO website. And just keep in touch and watch out for the next thing that we do. And get in touch with Jackie if you have any questions for Genius Within. So that's it. Thanks very much. Fo, would you like to add anything in there? I see your camera's on.
I am on, yeah. I actually didn't have a question, but I will take that offline. Thank you again so much. No, it's fantastic to obviously give the floor to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Kirsty, for working with the ladies at Genius Within for, what have been two very, very insightful and I would also say very puzzling conversations. I feel like there's so much information for myself as a person who is responsible for hiring, responsible for retention, responsible for consulting with clients on creative and representation. So much for me to unpick. So I'm sure that the rest of the audience has felt the same. Thank you very much. And guaranteed, Jackie, you will be getting an email from me very shortly.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.